Hi guys, so I ain't super prepared for this video, but I wanted to try and do one every week, and if I just keep stalling out, I'm going to end up doing it. So I've had a few questions, well quite a lot actually, so thanks very much for that. I'm going to work through a few today. So the questions today are, if a woman can lift a car off her baby if it's trapped underneath, can we tap into this during training? Which I think is a really interesting question. Can I give an overview of retaining strength while dropping a weight class? Why do I sometimes program slower eccentrics and constant tension work? So basically, is there any benefit? What's the benefit to this? Obviously, I think there is, otherwise I wouldn't program it. And who is my main resource, or who is the main resource that I trust for information in the fitness industry? Right then, so I'm going to start with the first question, which was about the woman lifting a car off a baby. You hear about these stories, and if you look into it, it's called hysterical strength. That's what the kind of term they use for it. And I don't believe it exists. So even though there are some prominent guys in this industry who say it's been well documented, I don't think it ever has been. I don't think it's possible. So I think a lot of the time the explanation is that in that kind of stressful situation where the baby's trapped under the car, the woman who's never trained before, she's just a little woman and she gets that big massive burst of adrenaline and she just seems to have the strength to lift the car off the baby, because I think the reasoning is we've all got this untapped strength that we do not use. Yeah, so I think there's a little bit to it, and I don't think you can apply it to your training in some sense. So yes, if you get amped up before a lift and you're really focused, say there was, like, I know people who might think about that kind of thing before they do a so say they're doing a deadlift and they're going to imagine their child trapped underneath the bar, and it's going to get them more amped up and they're going to get that adrenaline flowing and they can lift more weight, and they definitely can. Like, your arousal level is definitely something that affects your lifting. For me personally, I like to be really highly aroused, a lot of adrenaline going before I lift, and it makes a massive difference. So there's something to it. I just don't believe that lifting a car off a baby, an untrained woman, has ever been done, or if it's even possible. But I would like to talk about why you can get that. There is that untapped strength. It's maybe not as significant in my opinion, but there is that untapped strength there. And the explanation for this that I've seen in most of the videos that I've watched about it, I've read around this topic, so it's quite interested me, which is why I've picked it as the question, because yeah, I found it very interesting, is you hear a lot of people talk about neural drive or neural density, and you get a big burst of adrenaline and it increases neural drive and you can lift more weight, which kind of makes sense. So the neural drive aspect would be that your nervous system, your brain sending a stronger signal to your muscles essentially, which means that the stronger signal allows them to contract harder, produce more force. The problem is, I don't think this is the actual reason why. I don't think that's the mechanism. Now, I think there might be some level of increased neural drive, but when we think about how when you start training, a lot of the gains to start with are because you're not activating the full amount of muscle that you've got. You just get better at activating that muscle, which results in rapid strength gains. There's hypertrophy still happening, but it's slowly, and it isn't as significant to the gains in strength as these neural adaptations. But once you're past the beginner stages, you're getting towards intermediate, you've been lifting, say you've been lifting hard for a year, you probably aren't going to have, you're activating most of the muscle. That motor unit recruitment is very high. Like, even to start with, when looking at kind of single joint exercises, most average people who've never trained can activate something around 95% of the biceps during a bicep curl. So although there is scope to improve it, and I expect there's more scope on compound lifts, multi-joint exercises, there probably isn't as much scope there as you might think or might have been led to believe, especially when you get past that kind of year mark. You're probably very efficient at recruiting the muscle that you've got. So if you're recruiting all the muscle that you've got, how does a enhancement in this signal benefit you? Because you're already contracting all the muscle you've got, so you're not tapping into motor units or bundles of muscle fibers that you haven't yet tapped into. So that kind of mechanism doesn't make a great deal of sense to me. But what does make a lot of sense, and what, if you read the literature on when the increased adrenaline and the effects on force production, it's more than likely they're not finding a lot of difference before the neuromuscular junction. So you're getting that signal from your nervous system to your muscles. That remains pretty similar from what I've read. It's the actual changes within the muscle itself. That's one side of the coin. So that'd be changes in calcium handling. So for a muscle to contract, calcium, essentially, after the electrical charge reaches the muscle, and it sets off a cascade of events which leads to calcium being released from something called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. When calcium's released, it binds to troponin, and that exposes binding sites for myosin filaments. And then this is the sliding filament theory, or you might have heard cross-bridge theory, cross-bridge cycling. Now, you don't need to know any of this. What I'm trying to say is that calcium's imperative to muscle contraction. Calcium's needed. If calcium weren't there, your muscles wouldn't be able to contract. But what adrenaline seems to be able to do is increase the amount of calcium release, which is working right at that muscular level. And then that can increase the force of contraction, just because that myosin and actin are binding and releasing, it's happening a bit faster, which produces a bit more force. So that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is whenever we're lifting, there's kind of a brakes on to some extent as far as how much muscle force your body will allow you to exert, because at the end of the day, it's protective to itself. If you're not in a dangerous situation, it doesn't. If it's a case of, right, if I bench press this weight, I'm going to tear my pec off, or I'm going to tear my pec tendon off, it's going to stop you doing that. There's no actual benefit to it. Whereas when your adrenaline is released and your body perceives it as a more dangerous situation, those brakes are going to be less on, if you like. So these brakes are going to come from like afferent feedback, which is feedback from tendon organs, joint capsules, mechanoreceptors. They're all going to kind of give an idea of force. Muscle spindles. Now, Golgi tendon organ is often kind of thought of as one of the main kind of rate limiters of force production, but from what I've read, I don't think it is. I think Golgi tendon organ activity is quite high, even at submaximal weights, even around 50%. So it's probably not that, but there's probably something like the pain receptors around the muscles, it's nociceptors. So the more active they are, they provide feedback to your nervous system, which reduces neural drive or reduces the amount of muscle that you can actively recruit. And it's a protective mechanism. Once you get that adrenaline flowing, you're not going to get as much of this feedback to the CNS, which allows you to produce more force. So two sides of the coin there. At the muscle level, and also kind of taking the brakes off a bit, I don't think it's got a lot to do with neural drive itself particularly, maybe a little bit, but not. I don't think that's the main mechanism. And I do think that you can tap into it for strength training. Yes, get your adrenaline flowing, as long as, in my opinion, you want to be as much adrenaline as you can get flowing as possible while still maintaining technique. And that's on kind of your heavy days. You don't want to be doing that every set, because you are going to get burnt out to some extent. That's not central nervous system burnout, that's different sort of burnout. I'll talk about that in a different video. So that's question one done. Question two was an overview of retaining strength while dropping a weight class. So this is something that I work with people quite a lot on. I've had a lot of success with it myself, I've had a lot of success with it with clients. So if you want to drop a weight class, I'm presuming that you're going to be at a body fat percentage that is high enough that you've got scope to actually drop that weight class. If you're sitting at 10% and 100 kilo or 102 kilo and you're trying to drop to 90 kilo weight class, you're going to struggle with that, just because you don't have, like, your body fat's going to end up getting too low, you're not going to feel good, your strength's going to dip. If in most cases body fat's higher than that and you've got the scope to lose body fat, retain lean mass and make that weight class, you can retain most of your strength. Like I say, aim for 95% of current strength levels if you drop in a full weight class. In cases, I've had people actually build strength, and that's experienced lifters as well, not just not so experienced lifters. And a lot of that is to do with diet side. They're just nailing the diet now. But if you're losing body fat and you're not losing muscle, and you can adapt to the changes in leverage, you're not going to lose a lot of strength. To do this, you need to make sure that you're still lifting heavy weights. If you're powerlifting and you decide, right, I'm not doing any more heavy singles as I'll lose the weight, I'll get the weight off and then I'll come back into doing heavy singles, it doesn't work as well in my experience, because your leverages are changing as you lose weight. So your internal leverage as well as your external leverage. And if you don't kind of get to grips with these leverages on the fly as you're going, you're not going to be able to have as much success when you decide, you know what, I'm going to try adding in heavy weights now. So you need heavy weights. You're building skill at different leverages, so your skill's improving as you're dropping weight. That's one of the ways that you're going to be able to retain a lot of your strength. On the other side of the coin, you want to retain lean mass. If you retain lean mass, you've got that muscle to produce the force. So you've got the skill element of heavy weights. If you've got enough muscle, or you retain all of your muscle, you're going to be able to produce just as much force, in theory. And it does work out that way, in my opinion. So to do that, you need to focus on bodybuilding type work as well. So the assistance exercises, I wouldn't be just working 3 to 5 reps. I'd be working in all sorts of rep ranges, trying to hit PBs in the higher rep ranges, or at least maintain your strength on the assistance work. If you're doing, say, dumbbell power flies, one of my favourite exercises for chest hypertrophy, if you're using 40 kilo dumbbells for 8 reps at the current weight you're at, and you drop down 5-6 kilo body weight, and you're still lifting the 40 kilos for the same 8 reps with the same form, that's important. You don't want to let your form slide. At the end of the day, you're trying to stimulate the muscle, so that's got to come before the load. But if you can keep the loading up as well, it's a very good sign that you're retaining that muscle. So yeah, you've got to make sure that you keep building skill, working on skill, and retain full lean mass. Now, one thing that people, I think, one kind of sticking point people have is that they try to train exactly the same way as when the calories are higher. Now, with calories lower, you've got less resources to recover. You aren't going to recover as fast, which means volume needs to drop. But this isn't a huge issue, because we know that muscle mass can be retained on lower volumes. To gain muscle mass, you might need the higher volumes. To retain it, your volume can drop and you can keep the muscle as long as you keep the intensity high. That's been my experience with it. And when I say the intensity high, I mean the actual loading on the bar in those rep ranges. So you're talking 8 rep max sets, 10 rep max sets, maybe 6 to 8 rep max on the more closely related lifts to the main movements, such as deficit deadlifts or something like that. If you can maintain lean mass, maintain skill, or even build skill, you're going to be in a very good place, and you're definitely going to be stronger via formula, like a Wilks formula, but you could well be absolutely stronger as well. Not uncommon. It's just about setting it up the right way and adjusting volume as you go, which will likely need to drop down as you go. So you definitely drop out the fluff and just get the main stuff in. Next question was, why do I sometimes program slower eccentrics and constant tension work? So slower eccentrics, if it's a main compound lift, squat, bench, deadlift kind of exercise, the main reason that I'd program slower eccentrics, like a 5 count, 5 second eccentric, would be to improve positioning on the descent of the movement. Making sure that you're in the right position on the descent is imperative and the most important factor, in my opinion, as far as lifting the weight goes. If you're in a good position on the setup, good position on the descent, you can apply all that force right where you want it, and the bar's going to move. So that's generally the only real reason that I program slow eccentrics on the main compounds. A little bit different on hypertrophy focused work. So say I'll often program 5 second eccentrics on a hack squat, and often with constant tension as well. So the reason for doing this is simply because as you're taking slower to go down, so it might not be quite 5 seconds, maybe 3 to 4 seconds, going down a bit slower allows you to really think about the muscles that you're accruing. So if I'm doing a hack squat and I'm going down slower, I'm really focusing on loading my quads on the way down and getting maximal stimulation, rather than just dropping down and hoping that I come up okay. I think it improves the mind-muscle connection, which I think is important to some extent. Constant tension work, for me, you're basically talking about partials, but you're talking partials at long muscle lengths. So a hack squat constant tension would be you go right down to the bottom, you come up 3/4 of the way, then you go back down. And that kind of work, when you look at the research on it, partials at longer muscle lengths seem to be comparable with full range movements as far as hypertrophy goes. So if you're going right to the bottom and coming up most of the way and back down, that's going to build very similar. There's even an argument that it'll build more hypertrophy than if you were to come up all the way. And all that does, it makes it harder. So if you're making the exercise harder, it's going to restrict the loading a bit. Restricting the loading a bit means it saves your joints, tendons, ligaments a bit of stress. And that's the main reason for the constant tension. It's not because I think constant tension work is superior to full regular reps where you're locking out. Not at all. And in a lot of instances on the main lifts, I wouldn't kind of program that work. But for hypertrophy, I think there's a benefit to using less weight, so you've got less joint stress. So you can potentially do more volume, you can push for longer, and you're just not beating yourself up as much. I think one thing that people do kind of misinterpret a little bit with slow eccentrics is the fact that a lot of people will talk about how a lot of the muscle, a lot of the hypertrophy stimulus is built on the way down. So on the eccentric, you getting that high level of stimulus for hypertrophy. And the reason this is, it's generally down to passive tension. So in your muscle, you've got titin filaments. I don't know if they're called titin or titin. And basically, as they're quite elastic, and as they stretch beyond their normal length, they create mechanical tension, which is then giving that hypertrophy stimulus. To really take advantage of that, you'd actually want to be using super maximal weights and going down relatively fast. Like controlling a movement down isn't going to improve passive tension. It's probably going to decrease it a little bit, if anything, but I think this is negligible. But the reason for the slow negatives isn't to try and build more muscle, because I don't think that'd work very well. Last question was, who is my main resource, or who's the main resource that I trust for information in the fitness industry? For me, hands down, Greg Nuckols is the person that I look at, and the person who I think I've read most of his articles, and he's got a lot of articles. If you check out his Stronger by Science, we've also got a Stronger by Science podcast, which is great. I just think that what he says makes a lot of sense. He's not controversial as such. He doesn't write things for the sake of writing. Yeah, I really like him, and I rate him as, from what I've seen so far in the fitness industry, he's my guy that I'd look to for if I want to know anything. That's the first resource that I'd use. I'm also quite lucky in that my brother is very clever as well. He's a professor of physiology, or he was. So a lot of ideas on the kind of physiological kind of base, I can discuss with him to see if an idea actually makes sense or if it doesn't. So I'm quite lucky in that sense. And I think that's it for today. Managed to get through it. Any more questions or any comments, please let me know. Have a great day. I'll catch you again.